There's a moment, and I've been trying to find the right words for it since January, where you watch something private happen in public and you feel like you've accidentally walked into a room you weren't meant to be in. That's what it felt like. I was standing outside Windsor Castle that morning, just past the Henry VIII gate, the kind of cold that gets into your collar no matter what you do. Look, January 9th. I'd been sort of there since early, not because of Catherine, not for any particular reason except that I'd taken a few days away from London, and Windsor in winter has this quality to it, this gray-gold quiet that you can't manufacture. My coffee was going cold. I'd nowhere to be until noon. I didn't know it was her birthday. That sounds like something you'd say to make a story sound accidental. But I genuinely didn't. And I'm one of those people who tracks news the way most people track weather, loosely, at best. My phone was in my pocket. I wasn't filming anything. I'd a notebook, one of those cheap spiral ones, and I was writing down observations about the frost on the gate ironwork because that's the sort of useless thing I do when I've time. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Not a peaceful stillness, and the kind that happens when people who were moving have stopped, all at roughly the same moment, because something has shifted in the atmosphere that their bodies registered before their brains did. There were maybe 40 people near the castle approach, tourists mostly, a couple with a pram, and two American men in matching green puffer jackets who had been loudly debating whether they were looking at the right castle for the last 10 minutes. A school group a little further back, the kids, doing that restless shuffle children do when they've been told to stand still. And then the stillness. I looked up from my notebook. The American men had stopped talking. A small convoy, nothing ostentatious, no full motorcade, just 3 dark cars with. That particular unhurried purpose that royal vehicles always seem to move with had slowed near the inner entrance. Staff were visible, not frantic, not rushed. The kind of choreographed calm that takes years to learn. Someone near me said quietly, "Is that..." They didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need to. Plus, I want to be honest with you about something. I've lived in England my whole life. I've never been what you'd call a royalist, not in the waving flags, commemorative mugs sense. I find the institution fascinating the way you'd find a cathedral fascinating. It exists at a scale that doesn't fit normal logic. The history runs so deep you can't see the bottom of it. But I've watched Catherine, the Princess of Wales, with a particular kind of attention over the years. Not admiration exactly, and more like the attention you pay to someone navigating something very difficult with a degree of composure that makes you wonder what it cost them. Because it, in my opinion, always costs something. That kind of composure always does. She'd had a year that people were still processing. To be fair, the surgery, the treatment, the long, uncharacteristically quiet months. The public had wanted information in the way the public always wants information. Insatiably, and not always gently. And she'd come back, gradually, carefully, on her own terms. That January, she was 44. And standing in the cold outside Windsor Castle, I was about to watch something that, I keep coming back to this, I don't think was ever intended as a spectacle. That's what made it something. The cars stopped fully. A member of staff, a woman in a dark coat, efficient, eyes already scanning the surroundings, stepped out of the lead vehicle first. You could tell by the way she moved that her job was to create space, physical and atmospheric, before anyone else emerged. Then the door opened. Catherine stepped out the way she always does, which is with this particular contained elegance, not stiff, not performative, but as if she's made a quiet decision every morning about what she's carrying and how. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, deep navy, belted, no hat. Her hair, actually, was down against the cold, and she had that look she sometimes gets in photographs where she's clearly somewhere between two thoughts, present, but also slightly interior. She paused, which not for cameras. There were no official cameras that I could see, not yet. She paused to be fair, way you pause when the cold hits you and you breathe it in for a second before you go inside. The tourists had collectively stopped breathing. Now the American men, I kept coming back to them because they were the most unfiltered reactions in the vicinity. Both had their phones half raised and were frozen, as if they'd been interrupted mid-action and hadn't yet decided whether to complete it. And then the second car door opened, and I've thought a lot about how to describe the moment King Charles stepped out. He is, and I say this as someone with no particular brief for or against the monarchy, a man who carries visible weight, not honestly physical weight, which the weight of a thing that has been accumulating for a very long time. He moves with it. It doesn't slow him exactly, but it's there, a presence in itself. He came around the vehicle with a purpose that was different from the staff around him. Everyone else was in professional motion. He was in personal motion. And there's a difference, and your body reads it. Catherine turned. I couldn't honestly see her expression from where I was standing. I was at the wrong angle, and frankly, I wasn't going to jostle anyone to get a better view. But I saw her posture change, a very small change, plus the slight easing of something held carefully. He was carrying something. That was the thing that made the tourists, and me, lean forward almost as one organism. It was a box, which not large, roughly the size of a hardback book, maybe slightly deeper. It was dark, almost burgundy in the winter light, and it had the look of something that had been handled with care for a very long time. Not a new box, not a gift-wrapped thing from a shop, and the kind of box that has a history you can see in its surface. He held it with both hands, and which, if you know anything about how Charles moves, he's a man who gestures, who uses his hands to talk, who's rarely purely still, wasn'table. Both hands. Deliberate. The woman in the dark coat had created a perimeter that was more suggestion than barrier, but the crowd around me understood it. Nobody moved forward. Nobody shouted. This is the thing about the British public that still surprises me sometimes. There's an instinctive reading of when a moment is private, when it deserves its space, which even the kids in the school group had gone quiet. He said something to her, and I couldn't hear it. Honestly, I was too far. The wind was wrong. But I honestly saw his face. And Charles isn't, particularly, a man whose face conceals what he's feeling. And what I saw there was something I wasn't prepared for. Tenderness, the look, an unguarded kind. Not the public tenderness of a wave or a handshake or the formal kiss at the top of a staircase. The private kind that sometimes escapes people when they forget, just for a moment, that anyone is watching. He held the box out toward her, and Catherine took it, with both hands. She looked down at it for a moment. Just a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, and something happened to her face that I only caught in profile. A compression. Not grief, exactly. Not pure joy. For what it's worth, something between the two. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name because it involves too many things at once. She looked up at him. He nodded, just once. And TBH, she held the box against her chest. Pressed it there, actually. And the way you hold something you don't want to drop. And I saw her say something to him and then, briefly, bow her head. The woman next to me, I don't know who she was, a tourist. She had a red scarf. Put her hand over her mouth. The American TBH in the green jacket said very quietly to his companion, "What is that?" His companion shook his head. None of us knew, which that was the thing. None of us knew what was in the box. None of us knew what Charles had said. None of us knew what it meant to her, namely, in this specific moment of her life, 44 years old, a year of illness behind her, standing in the January cold outside Windsor Castle, holding something that clearly held weight in every sense of the word. But all of us felt it. Every single sort of person in that loose, accidental crowd of strangers felt it. Oh, which told me everything about what I was witnessing, even without knowing a single concrete detail. The school group's teacher, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 26, wearing a lanyard I couldn't. Read from where I was, crouched down next to one of the smaller kids who'd tugged at her sleeve. The child was asking something. I could see the shape of it, even without hearing it. The pointing, the wide-open face. I think, plus, who is that? What is she holding? Why is that man giving her a box? The teacher looked over at the scene near the cars, then back at the child. She smiled and said something short. The child nodded TBH with that solemn, totemic nod that small children produce when adults have told them something they've decided to file as important. I thought about that exchange for a long time afterward. And because children ask the right questions, and they cut through everything that adults train themselves to layer on top. The context, the politics, the dynasty, the complication, and the right question that morning was exactly what that child asked. What is she holding? The answer came in pieces. Basically, over days, actually. The way these things do when you're not a journalist and you don't have sources, you triangulate. You gather fragments. A photographer who had been doing legitimate press work near the castle that day posted on social media that evening. Not a photograph of the moment, which surprised me, but a description. He'd been further back than I was. He'd seen less. But he'd talked to one of the staff coordinators afterward, the kind of low-level professional communication. That happens in, I think, the margins of royal events, and what he'd gathered was this. The item wasn't new. That much was obvious to anyone who'd seen it. But the specifics, this took longer to surface, the way things do when they're real and not manufactured for consumption, were more layered than I expected. It was a piece connected to the late Queen, not given by the late Queen, necessarily. But connected, an object from the private collection that Charles had kept, had apparently been keeping for some time, waiting, and this was the word that kept appearing in the fragments I gathered, waiting for the right moment, which tells you something about how King Charles thinks about things. He waited. He held on to it. He chose January 9th, her birthday, her 44th birthday, and after the year she'd had, he chose this January 9th. I want to stop here and be honest about what I know and what I don't know. I'm not a royal correspondent, and I don't have access to the palace's inner workings. What I can tell you is what I saw with my own eyes, what I gathered from the people who were there, and what has since been confirmed in the quiet, understated way that genuinely private moments sometimes eventually get confirmed. Not by press offices, but by the accumulation of credible fragments that start pointing in the same direction. What I can tell you is this. The object had belonged to someone before Catherine, and Charles had decided it should belong to her now. The rest, the specific history of the object, its provenance within the royal collection, what exactly it meant to the woman who held it before, that's not mine to excavate. What matters, and what I keep returning to, is the gesture. Because the gesture is everything. After they went inside, and it happened in less than 10 minutes total, the whole visible portion of it, this thing that I'll apparently carry around for months, the crowd dispersed in the way crowds do when the extraordinary moment has passed and ordinary time resumes. The American men in the green puffer jackets stood together for a moment. One of them was scrolling his phone, looking for context, probably, trying, in my opinion, to find words for what he'd just watched. I don't even know exactly what that was, the shorter one said. But that was something. That was something. I wrote that in my notebook. Kind of verbatim. Because sometimes the ineloquent thing is the true thing. The woman with the red scarf had wandered away. And the school group was reforming into its crocodile line, the teacher herding children with the patient efficiency of someone who's been doing this for years. The pram couple had moved on, and the castle was just a castle again. Except it wasn't, quite. The air still had that charge that lingers after something real happens in a space. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. I stood there longer than I needed to. Here is TBH, what I know about heirlooms. And I don't mean royal ones particularly. I mean the object itself as a human phenomenon. An heirloom isn't just an old thing, and an old thing is furniture, an antique, a curiosity. An heirloom is a thing that carries a person inside it. When you hold an heirloom, you're holding someone's hands around yours. Someone who came before, someone who chose you, not out of obligation, or not because the calendar said to, but because they held the thing and thought of you and decided her. That's what Catherine was holding against her chest outside Windsor Castle on the morning of her 44th birthday. Not jewelry, not a, to be fair, symbol of rank, not the machinery of monarchy which someone's hands around hers. I've been around well enough grief and recovery, my own, other people's, to know what the second year looks like. The first year you're still in the acute phase. You're being held up by adrenaline or necessity or sheer stubbornness. People are watching closely. There's scaffolding everywhere. The second year is harder in a specific way. The scaffolding comes down. People assume you're through the worst. The watching relaxes, and that's when you feel the full weight of it. Not because it gets worse, but because you finally have enough stability to feel the shape of what you've been carrying. Catherine had that look, that morning, not broken and not fragile, but someone who has been through the full thing and come out the other side into a life. That looks like her old life but isn't quite, because she'sn't quite, and the task now is figuring out what that means. 44. Plus, I kept thinking about 44. It's not a landmark number, and it doesn't come with its own cultural mythology the way 40 does, or 50. It's a middle number, a year where the story is already well underway and the shape of the next chapter is becoming, slowly, not always comfortably, clearer. To get something irreplaceable on a middle number birthday, to have someone TBH see that year specifically as the right moment. Now, that's not a gift you give someone who you think of as a role. That's a gift you give someone you love. Later that afternoon, I found a cafe near the center of Windsor and sat with a better coffee than the one I'd let go cold that morning. There was a television mounted on the wall, sound down, running news footage. Catherine appeared on it briefly, official photos from the day, different location, different part of the day. Smiling, wearing the same navy coat I'd seen. Her children were in a couple of the photos, George and Charlotte and Louis doing what those three always do in photographs, which is exist with a kind of absolute authenticity that makes everyone who sees them feel something warm and a little aching simultaneously. The woman behind the counter glanced at the screen. "It's her birthday today," she said. To no one in particular, in the way people narrate the news when a television is on in a room. Then she looked at me. 44, she said. Imagine. I didn't explain that I'd been there that morning, that I'd watched it, that I'd seen the box, and what happened to Catherine's face when she held it. Some things, well, you don't need to explain, which some things you just carry with you. Yeah, I said. She went back to wiping the counter. The television moved on to something else. Outside, Windsor was doing its Windsor thing. Gray, quiet, permanent. The kind of place that has absorbed centuries of private human moments within its public walls and holds them without ceremony, without explanation. Just holds, I mean, them. A few days after I got back to London, a friend of mine sent me a link. And she's a journalist, the kind who covers culture and society, not royal affairs specifically, but she's a nose for moments. The link was to a short piece on a heritage website about the custom of royal heirloom gifting, not about Catherine specifically, and nothing contemporary, just history. Thought of you, she wrote. No other context. She doesn't know I was at Windsor that day. I haven't told many people. I read the piece that evening. It traced the tradition back centuries, the deliberate passing of objects within royal families, not as ceremony, but as the private language of inheritance, not the crown and not the official regalia. The other things, which the rings worn until the gold softened. The miniature, I think, portraits wrapped in linen and placed in drawers. Oh, the objects so small and so personal that they almost vanished from history entirely, surfacing only when someone wrote them down in a letter or a private diary. The piece made an observation I haven't been able to stop thinking about. It said, "The heirloom is the monarchy at its most human. It is how one generation says to the next, 'You belong here,' not by title, by love." I keep returning to the year Catherine just came through. Not because I want to dwell in it. I don't think she would want that, and I don't think it serves anyone to reconstruct grief as entertainment. But because the context matters to why that moment at the gate carried the weight it did. She had been, for a significant stretch of 2024, a person navigating a very private catastrophe within the most publicly scrutinized family in the world. I think, she'd had surgery, she'd had months of treatment, plus, and she'd done it and as much as she possibly could, on her own terms, in her own time, protecting what she could protect, her children's privacy first, her own second, the institution third. Kind of people debated this. The world had opinions about the timeline, the communication, what was owed to the public, what wasn't. People always have opinions. It's what people do. But what I watched at Windsor wasn't about any of that. It was about a man who looked at the person across from him and decided she needed something ancient and real and particular to her to mark the fact that she'd arrived at this birthday intact. Not performing intactness. Actually intact. Plus, there's a difference. Most people who've been through something real know the difference. And they know the performance intact feeling, the holding it together for the room feeling. And they know the moments when someone hands them something, a cup of tea, a long hug, a box held with both hands, that signals, "I see the real version. This is for the real version." That's what I watched. There's something specific about what King Charles did that I want to be careful about, because I think it gets missed in how we typically talk about the royal family, which is through the lens of institution rather than person. Charles has always been, from what's publicly known about him, a man who thinks about legacy in a particular way. Not just continuation, not just tradition for its own sake. He thinks about what things mean, and he thinks about why objects matter. He has spent decades advocating for craftsmanship, for the preservation of things made by human hands, for the idea that the physical world carries memory. So when he holds an heirloom from the private collection, something that passed through hands he loved, walks it out to someone he loves, and holds it with both hands, and waits for her 44th birthday specifically, that's not protocol. You know, that's Charles. I didn't talk to anyone near the castle while it was happening. I've already explained that. It felt wrong, the way it sometimes feels wrong to speak during a piece of music. But look, afterward, walking back toward the town center, I fell into step briefly with an older man who'd been somewhere in the crowd behind me. He was walking a dog, a very old and slow-moving spaniel, and we happened to be going the same direction for about a block and a half. He didn't say anything at first. Then, "Did you see that with the box?" "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment, and, "My wife died 2 years ago," he said. I didn't say anything. Sometimes that's right. "I still have a brooch of her mother's," he said. "I carry it everywhere. Don't know who I'll give it to yet, but I'll know when I know." The spaniel stopped to investigate something in the gutter. The man waited for it with absolute patience. "That's what that was," he said. "He knew when he knew." He pulled the dog gently on, and they turned left down a side street. I watched them go, and here is the thing about heirlooms that nobody really talks about. They aren't for the dead. The dead don't need them. They are for the living, specifically. For the living during the period when they're trying to remember that they belong to something longer than their own particular stretch of years. When everything feels shortened and specific and sometimes unbearably finite, an heirloom is a hand reaching back to tell you, this goes further than you can see, and so will you. Catherine, at 44, after a year of forced reckoning with her own body and its limits, I've to believe that landing in her hands meant something I can't fully articulate. But I watched her hold it against her chest. That's as close to articulating it as I can get. I've been asked, to be honest, since telling this story in smaller settings, whether I think the moment was staged, whether the cars happened to be in the right spot, whether the crowd's presence was anticipated, whether it was managed in some way. I've thought about this honestly. My answer, it doesn't matter. Not because staging doesn't matter in general, and it does. The royal family is, among other things, a communications operation, and communications operations manage moments. But here's the thing about genuine feeling. It's staged proof. Whatever the logistics of that morning, whatever decisions were made about timing or approach, what I saw on Catherine's face when she looked down at that box wasn't performative. What I saw on Charles's face when he held it out wasn't performative. The compression in her expression, the deliberateness of both hands, plus the way she pressed it to her chest. You can stage a moment. You cannot stage what comes up in a person's face when someone hands them something that means everything. I've seen enough of both to know the difference. A week after I got back, I was at a dinner party in London. Someone brought up the birthday. Plus, someone had seen the official photographs. There was the usual conversation about what Catherine was wearing, about the children, about whether she looked well, about the year she'd had. And then someone said, almost offhandedly, apparently Charles gave her an heirloom. Something from, the private collection. The table got quieter. Not because it was shocking, because it landed somewhere. What kind of heirloom? Someone asked. The first person shrugged. Something old, plus something that meant something. That's all anyone seems to know. There was a pause. That's enough to know, said the woman at the end of the table. She said it simply, not dramatically, which just as a fact. And look, the table. 8 people, various backgrounds, various opinions about the monarchy, various levels of interest, nodded. All of them. Plus without discussion. Because some things don't require elaboration, which some things are whole in themselves. The last thing I wrote in my notebook, standing outside Windsor Castle on the morning of January 9th, before I walked back into my ordinary day, cold. The cars are gone. The tourists are getting their phones back out. The school group is counting heads. The castle is just a castle again. But something happened here. Not a spectacle, not a statement, not news exactly. Just a person being handed something irreplaceable on a morning when she needed it. That's all. That's everything. Some, to be fair, people get through the hardest years of their lives and come out the other side to find someone waiting with both hands full. Basically, not everyone gets that. She did. On a cold January morning in the gray-gold quiet of Windsor, with strangers watching who didn't know what they were watching, only that it was real. Only that it mattered. And that, at 44, after everything, she held it like she wasn't going to let go.